Johns Hopkins SAIS campus locations here in Bologna, Nanjing, China, and Washington, D.C., as well as our main campus of Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland. A warm welcome to you all. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor over to our first student moderator, Ms. Arianna Bondi. Arianna is a second-year MAIA student just finishing up as part of our cooperative program with the University of Bologna. Arianna.
Thank you, Director Plummer. On behalf of our student body, I would also like to thank Mr. Timmermans for joining us tonight. We're grateful and honored to engage in this discussion with you. I'm Arianna Bondi from Bologna. I'm studying international affairs, and as Director Plummer mentioned, I'm finishing my second year. And as I prepare to start my career, I have to say that the world looks rather different than I used to imagine. I dream about working for the European institutions on international trade, and I really wonder how this possibility will look like and which will be the new European and global priorities. That's why I'm absolutely thrilled to participate in this discussion. And before giving you the floor, let me just quickly introduce the structure of our talk tonight. We will have 3 students moderating the discussion over 3 topics. We'll start with Emma and the green recovery before turning to Niklas, who will address the strengthening of democracy and the rule of law. And finally, Zoe will ask some questions about future scenarios after COVID-19. We welcome, of course, any questions from the audience. As Director Plummer mentioned, please make use of the Q&A box to ask questions that then the moderators will pick and relate to the Executive Vice President. Please also indicate your name and affiliation. And we apologize in advance if not all the questions are going to be addressed, but please do send them all in order to contribute to the discussion. And now, let's go no further. It is with great pleasure that I give the floor to the Executive Vice President, Mr. Timmermans. Would you have any opening remarks before we start with the first topic?
Sure, but I'll keep them very brief because I know you must have a lot of questions, and I'll try and answer your questions. The only thing I want to say is this. We were already in the middle of an industrial revolution. We were already faced with an existential challenge, which is the climate crisis. We're already faced with international relations that are really being rewritten as we speak. And now we are confronted with a pandemic that has really disrupted the world's economy and also has confronted us as human beings with our weaknesses, with our mortality, also with our strengths and our resilience. So the only thing I have, the message for you and your generation, my kids' generation, to get out of this mess, we will have to tap into the future. We will have to make sure we have the resilience, we have the funds to get our economy going again. Now, this will be on your shoulders more than on mine or my generations. So it is of vital interest that you take an interest in this, an active participation, and that you correct things if you don't believe they're going in the right direction. This will be on your shoulders, so we better get it right. And getting it right for me is to make sure we don't use the money we can muster to invest in the 20th century economy. These are going to be assets that are going to be lost, and that we will not have the assets to transform our society and economy to be resilient and sustainable. And then it will be on your shoulders. You will have an extra burden and you will have no results. So I hope you become very militant and make sure that we make the right decisions going in the right directions. And about that and many other things, I'm more than happy to talk to you tonight.
Thank you. That is a heavy burden to put on our shoulders, and we hope to take it on board very enthusiastically. As Arianna and Director Plummer have said, thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Timmermans. I'm Emma Slater, a first-year student from the UK, studying international relations and economics at SAIS, with a focus on European integration, transnational advocacy, and international development. And I will start the discussion today on the topic of a green recovery. For the Zoom watchers, please post any questions you have in the Q&A box for the discussion. Over the past few months in the lockdown, many of us have been inspired, despite the challenges, by the unprecedented and much needed reduction in CO2 emissions pollution globally. But now I worry, as large polluters like oil and gas companies, like the airlines, turn to national governments and the ECB for bailouts, we risk returning to damaging old patterns of consumption and pollution. In this crisis, we have a rare opportunity to renegotiate and implement restrictions on emissions and a phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. However, as many of these businesses are also embedded in our communities, Mr. Timmermans, what do you believe are the best approaches to ensure a green recovery is prioritized and enacted and that employment is protected?
I think you'll agree with me that for many people, no, let me start differently. Why do we have a Green Deal? Because we had massive support from the population across the European Union to do something about the climate crisis. Otherwise, there would be no Green Deal. That was on the top of the list of priorities of most Europeans. Leading up to the European elections and afterwards. Without any doubt, that's no longer on the top of their priority list. If you're struggling to keep your job, if you're struggling to stay healthy, or if you're dealing with sadness in your family because of loss, it's not the climate crisis that's going to be on the top of your list. However, the climate crisis is still upon us. So I think the big challenge will now be, how do you rekindle the broader feeling in society that we cannot treat the dealing with the climate crisis as a luxury on top of the recovery of our from the economic crisis? So because we need public support to do what we're doing. So I think we have a huge task in explaining that we only get one shot at recovery because of the, we have an investment gap of more than $1 trillion of private investment. Taxes will go down, so public investment will also be limited. We need to mobilize everything we can to be able to invest, to recover. But if we do not do that in the green way, then we will lose that money completely. And this is something we need to explain. I think we have an opportunity more than before, because people are waking up to the fact that you can't run a country with BS and populism, and that facts do matter, science does matter, analysis does matter. That gives us an opportunity to show that we have a real problem that needs to be addressed. But it will only work if we also have relatively immediate results. So not just investing in the things that will happen 5 or 10 years down the road, but also immediate results. So the things we could do, for instance, is invest massively in building, rebuilding, refurbishing, making sure that we create a different energy network based on sustainable energy. Immediate investment, immediate results, immediate jobs, because it needs to be done in Europe locally. Refurbishing of buildings, you get builders in. These are small and medium-sized enterprises, but you need also systematic approaches. These are the big companies. And immediate results for people who own a home or who rent, and their energy bills will go down, the value of their housing will go up. Another sector is transport. People are going to rethink the way they move, make sure that we help them move in a more sustainable way. In urban development, let's do a lot to create bike lanes, to create zero carbon emission public transport. Let's make sure we rethink aviation, that they share the burden, and that we rethink the way we move. So I could go on and on and on about this, but I think there is a case to be built of a green recovery that does not promise results 10 years down the road, but that can deliver results within a year, within 2 years. I think that should be the way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone from London, I can definitely accept not wanting to get on the tube at a time like this. So more bike lanes would be most appreciated. So I've got another question, somewhat related, from Tim Hildebrandt, who is from the Hertie School of Governance and is a former SAIS exchange student. In light of the global economic crises, how do we ensure both Eastern European states and other coal-heavy countries also do not misuse coal as a competitive advantage to boost their economic recovery?
Well, the thing is, I'm rather optimistic in many ways, because coal is the one energy source that really suffered also in the crisis. The consumption of coal was drastically reduced already before the crisis. And I think we still have about 30 coal regions in Europe. And when I talk to the coal regions, they will admit that there's no future in coal, but they want a future. So we need to help those regions to develop different futures, to develop a different economy, to develop different jobs, to reskill people there. So I think that is what we need to do. The one thing I worry about is how we deal with fossil fuels, other than coal, and especially oil and shale gas and things like that. There I see an interesting development in the industry itself. They just make the calculation, you know, being sustainable is just a smart economic thing. It's not just the right thing to do, it's also the profitable thing to do in the long run. So I'm rather more optimistic about our opportunity to make this transformation happen. But that also means that we have to be extremely careful where we invest the money, and also means that we have to be careful that investment capacity and taxation does not facilitate staying in fossil fuels, but facilitates the transition to sustainable fuels, which, by the way, it's selling itself. It's cheaper now to have wind energy. Well, now, of course, with no demand of oil, there's a temporary slump in prices, but it's still cheaper to have a sustainable energy. But we need also storage facilities. We need to invest in hydrogen as a storage commodity and also as a fuel. We need to create infrastructure for that. And then step by step, away from oil, into natural gas, and then from natural gas to synthetic fuels, or to green gases such as hydrogen.
Absolutely. You spoke about the investment and making sure that we put investment in the right places. I have a question from Raquel Gianfranchi. To what extent are EU green recovery policies coordinated with the European Central Bank?
Well, we coordinate a lot with the European Investment Bank, and the central bank is of course independent in its choices. But I can only be enthusiastic about what the central bank has said about where they see the opportunities. And by the way, it's not just the European Central Bank or the European Investment Bank. Just go and talk to the private financial sector, and they will all tell you, given the narrow availability of capital in the foreseeable future, the wise thing to do is to invest in something that has long-term revenue, and that takes us into a carbon neutral or a climate neutral future. So I think the signs are good midterm, long term. The threat I see is short-term panic. So if people start becoming unemployed, politicians starting to throw money at things that they think they need to do, whereas they're just wasting the money because they're creating lost assets by investing in the wrong direction. But I think if we listen carefully to what's happening in the markets, if we listen carefully to the central banks, not just the ECB, and to the financial sector, you can hear that, and huge investors, by the way, you can hear that they've woken up and smelled the coffee.
Yeah, there does seem to be a generational shift, which is very comforting. So I have another question from one of my colleagues, Charlie Laurie, who is studying environment, energy and resources at SAIS. His question is about green diplomacy and taking the European Green Deal beyond Europe's shores. How is the European Commission proposing to do this? And how does this sit alongside Europe's energy security of supply?
Well, first of all, I hope we can convince the country you know best to stick to its commitment in terms of climate neutrality, to embrace the idea of an emissions trading system also outside of the European Union, and to join us in preparation of the Glasgow summit to convince other parts of the world to go in the same direction. Now, other parts of the world will need different things. First of all, I'm not sure I should be saying this, but I'll say it anyway. Let's cross our fingers for next November in the United States. And secondly, let's see how we can convince the Chinese to come off the fence. I think they'll be okay in the long run in terms of their energy mix. But they've taken such a beating economically that it's not really easy for them to make these choices, which by definition, if you're dependent so much on coal, are going to be relatively expensive in the short run. And then with developing countries, I think Europe should take its responsibility, especially vis-a-vis Africa. And there we have to make a commitment, a credible commitment, substantial commitment to helping African countries in adaptation, because adaptation is not the most popular thing, because adaptation is sort of a recognition that there's already a lot of harm that needs to be addressed through climate change, but we need to do it in adaptation, but also in smart electrification. I think there's a huge wish in Africa to electrify their energy resources, and there's also a huge wish to try and do this in a climate neutral way. So we have a lot of work to do in climate diplomacy, but I think I mentioned a couple of parts of the world. There's other parts of the world that are going to be easier to convince, and they're on our side. Latin America, Canada, New Zealand, still a lot of work to do on Australia, by the way. But I think, an active diplomatic offensive in the year to come, leading up to the Glasgow summit, could be very successful, because I think there is a direct link to the COVID crisis and the need to sort of reinvent our energy mix and our energy sources.
Yeah, I think in that you've actually also answered Dante Fichetti's question about how we assist developing nations. So that's great. I'll now move on to another question from.
Well, let me give you one example. You have island nations that are really threatened to disappear, and then they see us dealing with the COVID crisis, throwing hundreds of billions on the table for recovery. And then they say, wait a minute, you don't even have a couple of millions for our survival. How can we understand this? If you're serious about helping us adapt to the new realities, put the money on the table. I think they have a fair point.
Yeah, absolutely. As a question of nationhood and citizenship for people, if your country goes under, is a difficult question. So I have probably one last question, possibly two. One from one of my colleagues as well, Mo Osterhuber, who has said, do you fear that there is going to be a delegitimization of green initiatives because arguments may be made that the pandemic is being instrumentalized to push a green agenda?
Well, I think, frankly, how can you instrumentalize a green agenda if you rationally can analyze the climate crisis? I think what is being done is to try and instrumentalize the COVID crisis to delegitimize the green agenda. And that's not based on science. That's not based on fact. That's based on ideology. So if they're making the argument that advocating a Green Deal is an ideological thing, no, it's a matter of survival on the basis of science. We've analyzed the problem. We need to keep the rise in temperature down to 1.5 degrees maximum. Take a look around you. Desertification, storms, floods. That's not coming from nowhere. That's because we've not got temperature rise under control. So I would say that, the ones who now are saying, well, it's a luxury, we don't really need it, it's an ideology. No, the ideological ones are the ones who are just closing their eyes and closing their minds for what is happening to humanity. And this is a responsibility I don't want to have on my shoulders. I think we need to really, really continue to work hard on the Green Deal. And I'm really pleading to get your support, because your generation is going to decide whether we're going to succeed or not.
Absolutely. Finally, I will have one last question on the practicality of the Green Deal and our push that we must go through now. So there's a question from Filippo Chiesa of EF Solare Italia. He's a SAIS alumnus from 2008 to 2009. And he says, do you think that the EU emissions trading system needs some tweaks or changes in order for it to be ready to continue supporting the energy transition in this new context?
Yeah, I think we need to expand it in certain sectors. I think we need to become much more stricter with free allowances, limit them or stop them across the board, especially if we're going to protect the European industry through a carbon border adjustment mechanism. If other parts of the world are not doing it, then if there is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, that's the protection. So you don't need free allowances anymore. So I think if we would limit the free allowances gradually, step by step, then the price of carbon would go up in the ETS, and it will also become more interesting for other parts of the world to join. I know the Chinese are thinking about the system. I know the Canadians are in Latin America, and I certainly hope the United Kingdom will follow us in this. So I think there's a good future, and I think it's still the best instrument we have to put a price on carbon and to also create the possibility for those who are doing extremely well to be compensated for that, and those who are not doing well to feel the pain of not doing well.
Yes. So that's now enough time on the green recovery. Thank you so much for answering the question. And to anyone who I didn't get to answer your questions, apologies. I'd like to now lead on to my colleague Nicholas, who will talk about democracy and the rule of law.
Right.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Executive Vice President, for being here with us today. It's a real pleasure for all of us. My name is Nicholas Hintermeyer. I'm from Vienna, and I'm a first-year student at SAIS Europe with the concentration European and Eurasian Studies. And besides my studies, I work as a journalist for the German-speaking issue of Forbes. And as Emma already mentioned, we will talk about strengthening democracy and rule of law in this current coronavirus crisis. Because for me personally, like a strong and progressive and strong Europe is crucial. That's why it's so crucial for me that like the fundamental values on which the European Union is built on, such as freedom, human dignity, democracy, rule of law, it's crucial that these are ensured, especially like in these times. However, like in recent years, in some member states, there were criticisms about their rule of law situation, like in particular in Hungary and like in Poland, there were many criticisms because of their introduction of controversial laws. So my first question would be, maybe we stay in Europe, but then we can also go on a global talk about the global level. How do you reflect this rule of law situation nowadays in Hungary and in Poland, and what has to be done to improve the situation?
Well, there is a new ideology, and the most extreme instrument. That's to say that democracy is the majority decides everything. And if I have the majority, I get to say everything. I get to say what journalists should write. I get to say how judges should rule. I get to say how the economies run, etc. Whereas I think a deep understanding of democracy is it's more important for the majority to show respect for the minority than it is to always rule by majority. Because today's majority might be tomorrow's minority, and then they want to feel safe as well. Once you go down the road of saying that democracy means I get to decide everything if I have the majority, you make democracy a zero-sum game, because then those in opposition will see it as sort of a mortal combat to get out of opposition. And you, if you're in power, will see it as a mortal combat to stay in power, because once you lose power, you will be treated by the new majority in the same way you're treating them now, and that's the last thing you want. So that is, in my view, undermining democracy in Europe and in other parts of the world. And for the functioning of the European was essential. You know, if you replace the rule of law by I am the most powerful, so I get to decide, you go back to a time in Europe where we don't want to go back to. And that's why everybody should show respect for the rule of law. Even the strongest and most powerful nation should say, okay, that's what the treaty says. I don't agree, but the treaty says it. I comply with it. And the only ones who can judge that are independent judges. And I want to illustrate why this is, very briefly, why this is so important in Europe. For the EU to function, we need a uniform interpretation of EU law. Since EU law is very often decided in Brussels with the Council and the European Parliament, but then has to be transposed into national legislation, we need to be sure that that national legislation ensures a uniform application of that EU law. Who's to judge whether that's happening? That is the national judge. A national judge in that sense is also a European judge. And if that national judge isn't sure about the interpretation, the national judge should be able to go directly to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice will tell the national judge how to interpret that European legislation. That's how we make sure EU law is applied in the same way across the European Union. If you then make a judge subservient to a minister or a government, then the government will tell him how to judge, and we no longer know whether there is an independent check about the application of EU law. So then the internal market can't function, investors aren't sure, etc., etc. So this is why it is so, apart from the things we were talking about before, how you see democracy, it is also for the functioning of the European Union essential that we have independent judges. Now, the one thing I wanted also to mention, because I keep banging on about your generation, I can't help myself. One thing I'm also worried about is that in the younger generation, I saw again a study today, the attraction to autocratic politics has increased. So 44% of young Europeans seem to think that to solve today's problem, autocracy might be a better solution than democracy. That really gets me worried. And I'm with Churchill on this. Democracy is probably the worst form of statehood, with the exception of all others that were tried. And I think we have a huge duty to defend and revitalize our democracy, because once we lose that, it will be dog eat dog again, the European Union. And we've tried that for centuries, and it never worked without wars.
Very interesting. I haven't received any questions now, so I will ask you one question. You mentioned that more and more people especially like the younger generations in favor of autocratic systems, or like what should the European Union do to really say, okay, our best system, so to say, is like the democratic system where everyone has its say in, like, with various opinions?
Well, I think it's not just the European Union. I think national systems have the same problem. We've had so many crises, and then we're in the middle of an industrial revolution as well. Then there's a climate crisis. So there is a level of insecurity in our society that is quite unprecedented in the last decades, and this has created, especially after the last crises, in two large parts of the population, the feeling it's not about me. They don't care about me. If we want democracy to revive, to be stronger, we have to show that we leave no one behind. And we also have to be more vocal against those who pander these horrible ideologies, such as the replacement ideology, which is popular with parts of your generation and which is infecting in a horrible way European society. So if you believe in this replacement theory, which means Jews will replace us, or they're getting migrants from Muslim countries to replace us, etc., then your survival becomes an existential thing, depending on the not being present of different people in Europe. Now, that in the past of Europe has always been a recipe for disaster. So if we start seeing somebody who is different as a threat to our survival, then we will want them removed from society. And I think this is where Europe is in touch with its absolute darkest angels. And these darkest angels should be kept in a cave, in a cage, far away. And that's why I believe, tolerance, solidarity, the fight against racism and xenophobia are existential fights for the future of our democracy.
I have a question from Emma Slater, from our other moderator. She says, like, she asked, fake news has been critiqued as undermining democracy. And how do you see, like, the role of media in protecting democracy?
Well, I believe in a democracy without vibrant and independent media is always at risk, because one of the elements of the sort of illiberal democracy, as I think Orban calls it, or guided democracy, as Putin calls it, is that who is in power holds the pen of a journalist. And then the information gets completely distorted and is instrumentalized all the time. Now, I lived in the Soviet Union when it was still in existence, before you guys were born. And there, people knew they were lied to. They knew it was a lie, and still it worked. That's the interesting thing about lies and propaganda. You know you're being lied to, but still it works. And that I find in a society like ours, with all our differences, extremely dangerous. And then, of course, if you polarize society, as is being done by many populists, so your political adversary is no longer your adversary, but your mortal enemy. and you can get your supporters to believe that, then you can say anything or do anything, but they will still support you because you are the one protecting them from existential threats. And that's, you know, sometimes we might be surprised, well, this guy's been lying so often, he's lying thousands of times, still they support him. Yes, because it no longer matters. If he's the leader of your tribe who is defending you against extermination, then he could do whatever because you need him for survival. And that in a democracy, I think, is a challenge. And the only ones, I believe, who can dismantle that challenge in a way that is in line with our values, or one of the most important players in this, are journalists. Just reporting facts, making analysis, keep asking the questions, not being bullied, not being intimidated, and just reporting.
Totally agree. I have a question from Susan Hooper. She asks, what do democratic economies need to do to redirect away from the zero-sum political game that we see happening in many major Western economies?
I believe it is. I believe the people who are creating that zero-sum game, and I would like, if there are any people, social scientists among you, people studying politics, for heaven's sake, give us a better definition than populism. We need a better definition. But anyway, I don't have it, so I'm just pleading for you to come up with one. But the people who are using that tactic to be in power, they need to have enough people who believe the system is rigged against them, so that they become, that they reject the system as a whole. And you know, all the speak about the elites and they don't care about us. And so that is the thing that needs to be tackled with the economy, so that people, that you show that we leave no one behind and that we have an inclusive society. And the thing is, it's so easy to if you lose your optimism, if you don't believe in a future for you or your children, you will want to break everything. And that is what's happening in too many of our societies. So we need to bring back optimism concretely by showing that we know what social protection is, by showing that we know how people in difficulty need help, and by starting, but this is a socialist talking, by starting to revisit our taxation system. You know, if you see how rich you can get if you have capital and then not even pay taxes, and at the same time, if you have to earn your living by working, how you're taxed, there's something seriously wrong in the system. And we need to revisit and reinvent, I would say at the European level, progressive taxing systems that create more equity and more justice in our societies. But listen, I'm telling you, this is ideological what I'm saying, and I'm a socialist and I don't hide it.
Okay, all right. Maybe as a last question, it's from David Heimberger. He was a SAIS student 2 years ago, and he asked, you mentioned both the threat to uniform interpretation coming from judicial systems with reduced independence and the threat from the appeal of non-democratic governance. How does the European Union then best balance responses to national judicial systems that argue they safeguard democratic protection, but in so doing may undercut uniform interpretation? I think he also refers to the German Constitutional Court like decision.
Well, I think, you know, coming from the European Commission, in any legal system, if the final judge has spoken the final ruling, that's the end of the matter. And I don't know of any legal system where a lower judge can just say, well, I don't really like this judgment of the higher judge, I second guess it. That never happens. And the whole European structure is built on the fact that the Court of Justice in Luxembourg has the final say, and that the primacy of EU law in the national systems is a long established principle by also the Court of Justice in many rulings in the past. And if we then give up on that, then we don't have a European legal order anymore. So this is a fundamental point in Europe's legal order.
Thank you very much for answering our questions, and also thank you for the participants to answer the question. It was really exciting and many new.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
I give the floor to Zoe Strauss, who will ask you about the last topic.
Thank you very much, Nikki. And thank you, Mr. Timmermans, for being here today with us. I'm Zoe Strauss. I'm studying international political economy at SAIS, and I have a particular interest for the intersection between regulations and cutting-edge technologies such as AI. And we'll now turn already to our final topic of this discussion, which is anticipating the world post-COVID-19. And again, for all of you who are listening to this conversation on Zoom, please do send questions about any kind of topic in the Q&A box so we can have an interactive discussion. So, as students, our expectations about the future have mostly changed for the worse over the past couple of months. Personally, I think we're heading for a much more individualistic society whose dependency of technologies will only increase at an even faster and more invasive way through, for example, more remote working. And I suspect that the protection of privacy of online users in all of this will be somewhere at the bottom of the list of priorities or very hard to implement in practice. But given that the crisis can be an opportunity to push for controversial policies or accelerate trends that were already developing under the normal circumstances, how can we ensure that the little privacy that we still have today does not disappear completely in the aftermath of this crisis?
Well, first of all, you know, as I said before, Ms. Strauss, we're in the middle of an industrial revolution, and it's happening. And it's a technology that is, it's also a revolution that's happening at breakneck speed, and it's affecting every living being on this planet. And that's the first time in human history. Usually it was more gradual and affected parts of the world and the rest. Now it's affecting everyone. And, you know, as you said, in some areas, it's mind-boggling. We still don't really understand the consequences. You know, if you have artificial intelligence that is able to develop further and further a form of self-awareness, what does that mean? You know, just think about this for 10 minutes. What does that mean? Does it then, if a machine has more self-awareness than 90% of the animal kingdom, is that machine then inhibited also with rights or not? And then if that self-awareness develops in a certain direction, what right do we have to regulate or to control, etc.? These are mind-boggling questions that will confront us. But I'm slightly more optimistic than you seem to be. I think the COVID crisis has also proven to us that we need each other. Where would we be without the doctors and the nurses now? Where would we be without the people bringing us the food or assuring essential services? And they don't just do that because it's their job. They do that because they're committed to society. So that I mean, it could give us a boost of togetherness, of feeling of community, of society, that could counterbalance this huge streak of individualism that we also see. But we will have to come to terms with these new developments in, I would say, in a form of debate and legal order that needs global approach. And I believe that sometimes in Europe we give the good example. I think, you know, we were heavily criticized for GDPR as we made it. I was myself one of the architects of it, heavily criticized. And then people were a bit burdened by the fact that they had to go through all their relations online to check whether it was in line. It was sort of like a spring cleaning exercise at the end of the day. And now this is becoming the norm globally. Other parts of the world are saying, well, the Europeans got this right. We need protection of our personal sphere, and we need to regulate that. Now, I also believe there is, and I'll end on that, so I'm not too long. I also believe there is, we are from the old world, parachuted into a new world. So we react with the knowledge from the old world to try and grasp the new world. Your generation already is, to you, this is not the new world. This is just the world. And I see it with my own kids, the ease with which you approach these things is too carefree, but at some point you will be the ones who will understand how to control it. And you know, we try and regulate privacy, and at the same time, many of us seem to be oblivious of what happens with everything they share online without even giving it a thought. Final point. as in the traditional economic analysis, we saw labor and capital as the two production factors. We need to add two more production factors if we want to have a coherent economic theory. So it's labor, it's capital, it's data, and it's nature. If we approach economic theory and economic projection from those four essential production factors, which have a relationship to each other, then we will start finding solutions. Because citizens, you and I, everyone, is giving away billions worth of data to tech companies who are then marketing what you're giving them for free and not recompensing you for that. If you understand that this is one of your production factors, you don't go work somewhere without being paid, do you? Well, unless you're a volunteer, but normally people work and get paid for the labor. If you give data, you should get paid if you want for what you're giving, because other people are making a profit. If you use nature, the price of the use of nature should be calculated in our economic model. So I think let's look at this from the perspective of four production factors, and that might help us understand the intricacies of what we need to deal with at a global scale.
Yeah, no. Although with the big tech companies, again, it seems a bit too little, too late. But
we can regulate them, and you know, I've started this discussion with them 4 or 5 years ago, together with at the time Justin Trudeau, who was still in the opposition in Canada and later became prime minister. And we talked to them, and they were ultra-libertarians, saying, well, government should stay out, we regulate it ourselves. And I told them, and I keep telling them, if you are perceived as a threat to people, and this is going to happen, you will be regulated. And if you're not part of helping us get it right, you will be regulated badly. But any public authority, if their citizens are seen as threatened, a public authority has an obligation to act. But you're unaware, you don't know what to do. And that will help us then understand it. But there has to be regulation. And there has to be bloody taxation. These guys aren't taxed. You know, everybody's taxed. You know, the corner shop is taxed, but they're not taxed. That's unacceptable.
I know, I mean, I couldn't agree more on both points, both taxation and regulation. But we have here a question from Daniel Bloemers, who's saying, well, in light of increasing calls for less globally distributed value chains, how can we strike the right balance between openness, cooperation, and resilience in all of this?
Great question. And this is going to be one of the challenges we will now face. There is going to be reshoring. There is going to be regional resilience more. That's going to happen. And it's our task to make it happen, because I think it's needed. That's what the COVID crisis also taught us. But at the same time, we need to make sure it doesn't drive us into protectionism. So I think the way we do trade is going to change. And that is to increase our resilience, but not to close our borders. And that's a fine line. It's going to be very complicated, but this is the line we will have to find.
Yeah, no, especially, of course, for the EU, that's the break point.
Yeah, but others will do the same. There will be, you know, you've seen of the present American administration very, very coarse and very blunt attempts at reshoring. So because they were so blunt and they led to conflict, they were very often dismissed. But the thinking behind it is not entirely wrong. I think this is something we will need to look at. And the fact, you know, what I would like to say in addition to that, then they start blaming the Chinese for producing in China. And I'm saying, who went to China? It's not the Chinese that forced us to go. It was the big companies who thought they could produce cheaper in China, and that's why they went to China. So if you want to blame someone, blame the companies and make them reshore.
Yeah, no, true. I have a question here from Kurt. A question that I have a particular interest in too. How could you comment on the apparent lack of a joint European approach to the COVID-19 crisis? He's mentioning conflicting policies cross borders, impose export bans, and yeah, maybe bring it to a broader question. How is this COVID-19 really threatening the European project?
Well, I think, you know, I have some understanding, because healthcare issues, member states never thought to pull that on the European level. This was really seen as national policies. So if there's a healthcare emergency, countries just sort of try and solve it on their own. And this led initially to the closing of borders, but I think we were able to rectify that by creating green lanes so that European citizens could receive the goods they need from other countries as well. I think there is an increasing understanding that we can only get out of this if we stick together as Europeans. I also believe that countries are learning from each other. You see it. Some are saying, "Do we need facial protection or not? And then they're looking at each other and learning." So I think that's also positive. But I think you could be negative about this. But what I also at a global scale, what we could say as Europeans, nobody went broke because they needed to go to hospital. Our social systems and protection systems kicked in. Of course, they're under strain, but they kicked in. Nobody was thrown into the streets. Of course, we still be facing a lot of things, but the fact that our social model was able to, it's under strain and it's hurting, but it's still standing. And I think this is something that is also something we can show to the rest of the world. There is a lot of merit in basing your society on solidarity, on creating social systems that protect the weak, on making sure that people don't become unemployed overnight, on making sure that we can invest in our health systems, and we need to invest in our health systems to create more resilience. So it also gives me a bit of optimism that we are able to confront these things. And with all the differences, culture and others, we have in the European Union, in that sense, we're as Europeans quite unique in the world.
Yeah, no, I agree. If you have on one side a surveillance state, another side a situation without medical care, I guess being in the middle is not a bad position.
No, just imagine that you have to go somewhere to a hospital because you're very ill, and then they ask, do you have insurance? And you have to say no, and they say, well, then sorry, we can't help you. I hope we never get into that situation in Europe.
No, I hope so too. I would have actually an immediate follow-up question on that. Would then the EU would push in the aftermath for a European healthcare system to handle future crises like this one?
Well, I think let's have a quiet talk about this once we've come to terms with this crisis, and let's listen to the member states. I wouldn't feel comfortable in saying from the Commission, we see this as a terrible, wonderful opportunity to increase our powers or to increase our. Let member states draw their own conclusions on this. I think we will be closer together. I think there will be, the European collective procurement of PPE or of respirators or other medical equipment is something that will happen without any doubt. So there will be more coordination at that. I would also think that although we have different privacy regimes in terms of healthcare, that Europeans as citizens will want to be sure that they can get adequate help in other member states if they are in another member state. So also there, I would see higher levels of coordination. But I would feel very uncomfortable if we would try and use this as sort of a power grab for the Commission. That would not be my feeling. But I hope member states will come to the conclusion themselves that there is a merit of doing more together, also in the health care sector.
Yeah, coordination seems like a right approach. I think we could answer one last question before we wrap up.
Okay.
Question here from Robert van Eert. Where is the European Huawei? What is the Commission doing to create a European tech champion that can compete with the Chinese and the Google, Amazon? And I would add, do we really want such a tech giant?
Well, I think what we need is to see where we lead in technologies. And I would certainly see in 5G possibilities. I would especially see possibilities in renewable energy. If you talk about reshoring, I think we should make the next generation solar panels, the next generation wind turbines. I would love to see us make batteries that don't depend on rare earth and that can be recycled. I would love us to continue to lead in hydrogen technologies, where we still lead the world and where we need to invest. So I think there are quite a number of areas where Europe can lead, but we also have to be realistic. In some areas, we just missed the boat. We used to be. I remember, it's perhaps a nice anecdote. I remember when Hillary Clinton, when I met her the first time, when she was a colleague, and she saw my phone, my cell phone at the time, not even before a smartphone, and she had 3 phones for 3 different parts of the world, and we, with our GSM system, could use our phone everywhere. And she said, "My God, that's such an advantage of the Europeans." So in there we were leading. And then sadly, I think somewhere in the headquarters of Ericsson and Nokia, people were saying, "Oh, a smartphone, that's not going to work," or internet, not that important. I think something like that must have happened. So we missed that boat, but there are other boats and there are other technologies. And if you see, I mentioned them a bit jokingly, but if you see where Nokia and Ericsson are today, they're leading in many fields, in new technologies and different technologies. So, let's not be too pessimistic about this. And in the energy transition, Europe can lead also on renewable energy, on the networks we need to create. And I would say also on the smart cities we can build. Let's see how we can green our cities, make them carbon neutral very quickly, make them more livable. Then Europe, don't underestimate the attractiveness of Europe as a place to live. It's still something many people, even if they will not admit it, in the rest of the world are jealous of.
I think it's good to finish on this high note, and I'll hand it over now to Director Plummer. And thanks again for all your answers.
Thanks a lot for your questions.
Okay, let me join my student colleagues here in thanking you, Mr. Timmermans, for a very interesting talk. It was amazing how many challenges you were able to go over in just 1 hour. And with solutions, however. I think that we're all leaving this talk with the feeling that, yeah, we've got these challenges, but we've got ways of finding solutions to them. And very fortunately, it's going to be left to the next generation to do that. But I should say that looking at our students here at SAIS, that I have great faith that they're going to make the right choices. And I'm sure, Mr. Timmermans, you'll agree with me with the quality of the students that we have, that the future is bright indeed. So let me just thank you for your time and talking to us. And I hope sometime in the future, when the borders are all open, we can invite you actually down to Bologna to spend time with us in person and show you some Bolognese hospitality and the reason why people want to live in Europe. So.
Well, I've had the privilege of living in Italy, and then I feel like an honorary citizen of Italy for many years. But if you will, you allow me 1 more minute, because what you've said, what you've just said, inspires me to say the following. There is such a tremendous responsibility on our generation and next generations to get us out of this problematic situation we're in. But I would also say to the brilliant students you have, don't forget the others in your generation who are not brilliant students, who are very often struggling and very often don't really see a great future, and then become attractive by, I would say, destructive ideologies of exclusion, of hatred, etc. And the one thing that we need to understand is that if we break down our conversation with them and our dialogue with them, we all lose. So my plea to you is, yes, talk to each other, help each other become the brilliant people that will lead us into the future, but don't forget about those who are less fortunate and are struggling and sometimes develop anger and hatred and fear out of the feeling that they are struggling and are not being taken up in our society. And don't leave them behind. Talk to them, engage with them, even if you don't like what they're saying, listen to them and argue with them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Very wise words. And so thank you very much, and a virtual applause from
Thank you.
all of our students and faculty, staff, and other visitors. So, and those of
Thank
you out there in Zoom land, thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Yes.